Hello and welcome to Cypherpunk Bitstream 0x05 out of the TAZ0 in Berlin. I'm Smuggler and our current topic is current and future security, and with me here as always is
Frank Braun. Hi.
Hi, how are you doing?
Pretty good.
No coughing yet?
No, but I think the cyberpunk age is off to a good start, with a potential pandemic at our hands.
Yeah, so I'm really happy that our face mask fashion establishment plan is coming to fruition. So in the future, we'll not stick out wearing face masks anymore.
Exactly. It's fantastic. We set a trend here.
And just for those people that don't understand humor, no, medical masks are not the thing to wear. You want to wear an FFP3/N95/N99 face mask and protection goggles.
Yes. So we will upgrade our gear accordingly.
Yes.
Which kind of brings us to our the topic of today, doesn't it?
Well, in a sense, because the lockdown in Wuhan it has a few very interesting, relevant aspects for the question of future security.
But first of all, what is current security?
Well, first question is, what is security in itself, I guess. So
yes.
It's one of those terms that everybody throws around, and it has different meanings in different contexts. So there's number one is we should make the distinction between safety and security. Safety is about the reliability and resilience of systems. So it's mostly for protecting against random failures. That is safety. When we're talking about airline safety or aviation safety, it's about the plane staying in the air and not catching fire or falling from the sky. Security is a little bit different. Security is about introduction of unusual events, and mostly events by actors. So it's not about a system working like intended in normal circumstances, but it's about outside forces intervening. So when you're talking about airline security, you're more talking about what happens if the pilot is drunk, or if some dude brings a gun on the airplane and stuff like that. So that is security. So it's unusual events that usually go back to an actor. That is security. And when we're talking about security in the context of national security or international security, we're talking about actors. So we're talking about a system that is in the current state, our country or the world or whatever. And then we have people and organizations that want to change something about that. And to prevent them from changing that is security. And you have the same thing in computer security versus computer safety. Computer safety is about your software runs continuously, doesn't eat up your memory, whatever. That is safety. And security is when this dude from Ukraine who's too intelligent and too poor tries to find your credit cards.
So safety is often related to correctness especially in computer programming. So in our face mask example, safety would be that the mask actually filters stuff.
Yes.
And security would be about the virus.
Yes.
The external actors. So
yes. Yes. Yeah. Though the virus itself is not really an actor. So
sure, the example falls a bit short here, but
yeah. But you have the same distinction when it comes to health safety and health security systems. So a health safety system would be your hospital's working, there's a new virus, they're able to detect it, they're able to sample it, quarantine, whatever. That is like safety. And total security is when the hysteric mob on the outside tries to break in because they all think they're infected. That is total security. So it's the outside actors that make the distinction in this case.
So the zombie apocalypse is mostly a security question.
unless it gets triggered by a Chinese virus, then it might be a safety issue as well.
I see.
So, and the interesting thing is that security and safety both are core demands actually that humans have. I mean, you kind of want to know that your car continues to work when you're traveling on the German Autobahn with 200 kilometers an hour. A tire falling off is a safety issue, and quite a big one. You know, you don't want that to happen, so you want safety.
And even if it doesn't work, you want to have, I mean, you cannot really expect systems to work perfectly all the time, but if they stop working, you want to kind of have them fail in a safe way.
Yes.
Right. So you would rather have your car, that some warning light goes on and tells you should really change your tires, than that the tires just fall off at 150 kilometers an hour.
That would be really useful, I think.
Yeah.
And security is the dude standing on the overpass throwing down a stone. And both of these, safety and security, are really, we humans would really prefer to be still alive tomorrow. And we would really like all our capital and all our systems and all our property to function tomorrow, at least as well as they do today.
That's generally the case, I think.
Yeah. That's something that is not a natural state. So to have safety and have security is not a natural state. It's something that has to be maintained. So safety, when we're talking about the failure of systems from random events, etc., it has a lot to do with how high the quality of the system is. And it also has to do with entropy. So entropy is this natural thing that happens all the time. Things decay, things get old, things break. It's a function of physics. And to actually have safety, you have to maintain the system.
It's hard to negotiate with physics. So yeah, we kind of have to deal with it.
Yeah, though there are quite a few people that behave as if physics doesn't exist. So, and this was not a shout out to the flat earthers. And so it requires maintaining. While a lot of people understand that safety requires maintenance and quality assurance, quality control, all those things, I think when it comes to security, especially in a lot of Western countries, we often think that security is not really necessary, or maintaining security is not necessary.
Why is that?
I think it has a lot to do with people are not being exposed to security failures that often. I mean,
they feel too secure, so they kind of become used to being secure, and then
they forget that security is not a natural state. I mean, the problem really is that if you take a larger number of people, you will always have people in there that are hostile. It's a normal thing, no matter how advanced and enlightened your society is. You always have assholes. Assholes are a security risk. You always have people that want to steal stuff instead of working for stuff. And you also have a few people that are, I'm not sure if it's the right word to use, but they're kinda evil naturally. So evil is like, that's a problematic term here. But you have people that are natural predators. They're psychopaths, they're sociopaths, and for them to break security is a psychological necessity. So that is the way they function. It's not enormous amounts of people. It's not like 50% of society, but it's somewhere between 1% and 5% of humans have this psychological pathology of being sociopaths or psychopaths. And then you also have this issue that life can present you situations in which you don't really act rationally. That's something that can happen to really everybody. Be in the wrong circumstances, and you might turn out to be a thief, a killer, or whatever. So it's unpredictable, and it's one of the things that just can happen.
I think some people also just like playing with overcoming security systems. Like you can see that in Black Hat IT, for example.
Right, and then you have the hackers. Yeah. Though hackers are usually not that big of an issue. Like overcoming security systems is not that big of an issue in itself if you're not malicious.
Sure. But I mean, some people just like the sporty aspect of doing that.
Right. And they might actually really break things for the lulz, which makes me wonder how much of that is psychological pathology right there. But that's a different topic, and we're not the experts for that. So, yeah, I think to come back to why people ignore security, I think it really has a lot to do with people not being exposed to security risks. Because in a lot of Western countries, for most people, stuff works most of the time. If you're like the typical white middle-class dude, you have pretty much no relationship with security issues, because you know which parts of town you aren't welcome in. You don't ever go there, so you sooner or later forgot that they exist. You do everything by the book. You only interact with big organizations that operate legally. So in a way, there is very little exposure to things like property crime, violence, etc. And then I think that a lot of these people forget that that is not a natural state. The more people you have that you're interacting with, like in cities and whatever, the more likely it is that you have bad actors in there. And either you keep them in check, or they can undermine whole societies. They can turn a society from a high trust society into a low trust society.
Which is economically like really problematic. Makes every transaction really expensive.
Yes, no trust societies basically don't work anymore. That's not a society. It's just people that happen to be in the same coordinates, so to speak. It's very hard to interact.
But even low trust is
very expensive. Very expensive. If you don't have recourse, if you don't have rule of law, if you have to expect that security incidents are dominant, then you only cooperate and trade if it's necessary. You're kind of forced into a sustenance kind of lifestyle societally. And I think you can see that a lot. There are a lot of countries that have those low trust societies, and they really have issues with economic development. They don't have functioning social institutions. They don't have reliable security mechanisms, and then you can't accumulate a lot of wealth there. You cannot accumulate significantly more wealth than your neighbor. Success is always punished in those societies. You kind of stick out and you become a target, So in a way, everybody is drawn into this mediocre state. And that's really toxic, actually.
Yeah, I once witnessed it in South America, where the crime rate was so much higher of like petty theft and things like that. So you really had to watch out for your belongings all the time, and that kind of showed me how expensive that is in attention wise. I mean, you really have to always focus on your stuff and watch your back and things like that. And that it's very, was very enlightening for me to see the difference, between, people being afraid of being in Berlin, for example. People from the countryside, they think, Berlin is dangerous, which it is relatively to the countryside in Germany. But, the situation there was a completely different one, Here you read like somebody being robbed, like you read about it in the newspaper, and there basically every second expat you talk to said, yeah, he was once robbed, at least once. So, Makes it really expensive.
And it also increases the stress that you experience all the time, which is not exactly healthy.
Of course. I mean, if you're drinking a coffee and you're worried about somebody grabbing your backpack, that's really, yeah. I still have it in me. I think I regularly say that when people have their, $1,000 iPhones on the, restaurant table, that, in certain countries you would never do that. Sit outside and have the phone lying there.
Unless you want to give a donation to the local gang. Yeah.
So,
and I think that it's really important to, when you look at that no trust society, low trust society, high trust society, I really think there are symptoms. It's not, a society doesn't just exist as being no trust. It's not an issue of the humans there being different. It's their environment that is first different, and then everything else follows, I think. So, I mean, in a sense, you have this issue that the values under which people operate are pretty much universal. Everybody on this planet more or less has certain core values under which they operate, and they're pretty universal. Self-preservation, it's the preservation of family and friends. It's a more or less defined private zone and stuff like that. So they're core values. And most people really want to just have a life that has as little drama as possible. People don't want to have drama.
You're not a drama queen.
Well, that's a different topic again, because I think the drama queens actually are looking for security as well. But, and they're drama queens because they want to test how reliable you are.
Want to test out if it's really secure.
But that's a whole different subject that we shouldn't go into. So I really think that fundamentally all humans operate on more or less the same operating system. But you have different, you have different environments, and people adapt to their environment. So if you have a high trust society and you don't maintain it, then those few % of bad actors that you have can erode that, and it becomes a low trust society. And in a similar sense, if you have a low trust society with a lot of effort, you could probably turn that into a high trust society. It requires it's a multi-generational project probably.
Yeah, I think so too, because once you're sufficiently burned, you will not regain trust
easily.
Yeah.
Yes.
You can see it, I think, in a lot of the ex-Soviet or ex-socialist states in the East, that they people have a much higher distrust against any sort of governmental systems and regulations and stuff like that.
Though changing those societies is not necessarily a government job, but that's a different subject. But how to turn a low security, low trust environment into a high security, high trust environment. And they don't have to be parallel. Can actually have a high security environment that is low trust. So they don't coincide necessarily.
No, I wasn't saying that it's the government's job, but even if the government improved a lot, which it sometimes did, people, you can see a certain lack in trust.
Well, which is, I think, natural, because trust is something that builds from a history of interactions. And if you have a long history with the government that was really bad, then you have to have a long history that is really good to overcome that.
Yeah. So like 1 or 2 generations long usually.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I'm not sure who made that, statement, but he said that even in science, ideas win not because they're better, but because the people that hold contrary ideas die out. And it's probably with social memory in general, kind of have to have the bad memory die.
think it's Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, if I'm not mistaken, the book. Who said that, who basically described the process.
Yeah. I hope you're right, because I was about to attribute it to Feynman, and then I said, no, probably not. So who?
No, definitely not.
Okay. So anyway, so the core to come back to is that security is not a natural state. It has to be maintained. And if you don't have security, it gets worse. If your security goes down, it becomes worse and worse and worse and worse. You know, you have to intervene more and more and more to keep it up. And in a way, security is, or the state of trust and security is also a learned thing. You learn from your environment if it's safe and secure, and if it is, you have more trust. But at the same time, that makes you more vulnerable to certain attacks, because a certain, not mistrust, but awareness and carefulness is something that is really important. And especially if somebody else provides security and safety for you, and you're completely disconnected from that process, then out of that doesn't come a person that is invulnerable, but that is vulnerable and naive, relies on a third party to maintain security and safety. And I think that is something that we see a lot in the classical white liberal environments.
Well, I think that's something that Western states, that's a situation they want to create, right? They want to provide security and also make people dependent on that security.
That's the ideology of statism.
Yeah.
You know, that's what it's all about. You know, I mean, I'm not sure how aware the players in the field are of exactly those ideas, but yeah, I think there are a lot of people working in state security, and there are good reasons for that. Say, okay, we want to maintain security, safety, etc. And in addition, we want to make sure that people don't have to deal with that themselves. And it's both, I think, a justification for their own existence, but it's also, there's a second aspect to that, and that is it increases the control you have. And the idea of statism when it comes to security is a really dominant one when it comes to how our current security systems look like. So in a way, we don't want individuals taking care about their own security, because it's the externalized security that helps a lot with maintaining unity, maintaining coherence, organizing things smoothly, and satisfying people, and also making people think less about what's going on, and also increase the fear that people have when that security structure is gone.
Yeah, I think it's generally a good way how to security is really good to increase the power of the state, or to justify, when you extend the reach of the state. I mean, it's a classic gameplay, right? You create fear. Let's say there's terrorism, and which generates fear in the population, and that, kind of creates a higher demand for security. And then the state, of course, is the one stepping in and providing that security.
The white knight theory of security.
Yes, and for that to work, of course, you kind of want to have the monopoly of security. So you don't want the people to have their own security, because then they wouldn't be as vulnerable and they wouldn't be as afraid, and then the whole thing kind of wouldn't work that well.
While that might look like that from the outside, I actually think that is a very cynical approach to security and the state. It really assumes that the people that work in the state, organize the stuff, have a much larger picture of why they're doing what they're doing. So I agree that it's like one of those interpretations that a lot of people have when they look at the state. They look at current states and government and whatever, and they say, oh, they game us and manipulate us, etc. And I think that it's a malicious interpretation of what's going on. And
what would be a benevolent one?
No, not necessarily benevolent, but maybe a more charitable one, in that we assume that the players in the state are much more similar to us when it comes to their intelligence and how far they plan, etc. So the malevolent, malicious interpretation of the state assumes that there are very conscious players on the side of the state that really just care about the maintenance of the state and are extremely cynical when it comes to everything else.
No, I wasn't saying that. It can also be emergent.
Exactly. And I think that the moment when you're thinking it's emergent, then all those questions of you do that for a certain reason falls apart. Then it looks from the outside as if this action is for a reason, but in reality, it's just an emergent behavior of the system. There is no reason for it. There's just a cause for it. And I think of course, there are actors in the state sphere that have long plans and that follow certain ideas, etc. I'm not denying that is true. But for the most people that are active in the security services, etc., quite honestly, they don't have the perspective. They aren't political thinkers. They're not that smart.
They're just doing a job.
That is really true. And a lot of those, I mean, there are different reasons for going into the security services, but a lot of people that go there with a certain idealistic idea. It's the typical psychological guardian profile. They want to go there because they actually want to do something good for their fellow men. If that is still true after working there after 20 years is a completely different question. But a lot of people, not all of them, but a lot of people that go there are psychological guardians. And then, of course, you have people that go there for save money, and have people that go there to exploit it, and all that, of course, is true as well. But the general profile of beginners in the security systems is usually a much nicer one. And that is true for a lot of those systems. Even for politics and whatever, it's usually not the psychopaths that are the dominant power when it comes to starting the job, but they're the ones that survive the selection process over several rounds.
Make it to the top. Yeah.
They make it to the top. And they're not necessarily smart long-term thinkers either. I think what's more interesting there is to take a step back and look at the systems itself and look at how those systems justify themselves. And that has a lot to do with state theory that we developed since the Renaissance, basically. Before that, there's no real thought about how to build a state. It's a very murky environment. Of course, there are philosophers that think about stuff like justice and how should law work and stuff like that. That is earlier. But the question of how to maintain population in a state is something that really only becomes a big topic in the Renaissance. And that is where we have Machiavelli, for example. So Machiavelli really, we have this idea that Machiavelli is always, how can I be cunning and tricky and betray people so they follow me as a leader? But Machiavelli is more like a philosopher of how states can work.
Mm-hmm.
And his conclusions are not necessarily humane. Of course, there's a reason we call Machiavellian thought. But the first thing there is observing how countries work, how countries interact with each other, how countries can prepare for security issues, war, for example, how to maintain unity and internal strength and mobilization, and all those subjects is where it comes from. And when you go further in history, we have a lot of these thinkers that think about how should states work. And sadly, a lot of the thought there, at least when it comes to its relevance for today, is that the Hegelian concepts have won. So the Hegelian concept is basically that the individual must serve the greater institution, collective, people, etc. And that is why when you, for example, look at the totalitarian systems that we had in the last 150 years, basically, is they're all Hegelian. They're all collectivist to the degree that the value of the individual really comes from serving the state. And you have that with National Socialism. You have that with state socialism and communism. It's all, you serve either the state or you serve the people, which are the state. So, and basically that is where your value comes from. That is what everything is for. All your actions are for maintaining that system. But just because we have those thinkers doesn't mean that the people working in those organizations think like that.
Of course not.
It's often just, it's an hen and an egg issue. I mean,
this thought often comes after the fact as well, right?
Yes. And that is probably really true for Hegel as well, because he actually kind of was in the environment of the military state already.
And it comes from the thinker types, and the thinker types are often not the ones who are doing active security services.
Yes. And I think that for really understanding how security works today and what has to be done, one has to kind of step back from the moral judgment in a way. So not so much think about, oh, they want to enslave us and they're all tyrants and whatever. I think that blinds us to really understand what's going on there. And I think it's much more prudent and profitable to look at systemic issues. How do those systems work? How do the people work? What are the motivators? How does communication work there? How do they select goals, etc., etc.? So I think that is the far more useful way of thinking about that.
Well, then let's look at it. What do you think? How do these systems work?
Well, we necessarily have a little bit of a Western perspective here, because we're coming from a Western background. Most of what we know is Europe, Germany, US. That's what we're acting in. The first thing that one should really keep in mind is that all of our security infrastructure is historical infrastructure. It hasn't been invented 5 years ago, but it's the process of the outcome of a relatively long historical process. And most of those institutions have existed for decades, sometimes generations. And
can you give a few examples of institutions you're referring to?
Well, the institution everybody should think about is, for example, the police, what we call generally the police. Mm-hmm. And most people, when they think about police, is those dudes in uniform driving around in the squad car with sirens on, whatever. So that's the police. They are not a new invention, and they cannot reinvent themselves easily. They go back to I think in Germany to the 1850s or something like that. That is where we really have the first real police units coming up. And since then you have this development. The organization changes to, over time. Of course, you have this succession of people. You have the succession of rules, rights, equipment, methods, etc. So, and they all are legacy systems in a way. I mean, they adapt, but there's a lot of legacy that they carry around with them. So the self-understanding of a policeman is a legacy thing. Plus, of course, they're not just organizations that are similar to, I don't know, like a company. If you work for a company, most people have no special meaning by working for a certain company, unless it's like the market leader and everybody knows it. But if you're working at a normal company, there's no specific high loyalty to it. When you're talking about, I'm working for that company, you don't get recognition for it, etc. If you're working for the police, that's a different thing. In a way, you're a different animal. There's a very high internal loyalty. There's only one of those units. That means all the focus, or one of those organizations. So all the focus is always on that organization. If you're working for a company and that company does something bad, it doesn't necessarily influence you personally, other than you have to take another job. But if the police does something bad and everybody is annoyed about it and calling the police bad, that will always hit you as a policeman, because you can't be a policeman outside of the police. So there's a much tighter local loyalty, identification, etc. And that is where we have problematic issues coming from. So there are those high level issues, and that is that police has, because of its singular existence, has this huge internal loyalty, which can lead to groupthink. In not just when it comes to group thinking about information, but also in developing this us versus them notion of the world. That is where the thin blue line comes from. If some random person is killed on the street, you have the capital crimes unit dealing with it. That's it. But if a policeman gets killed, every policeman is affected. So then you have those manhunts, for example, or you cover up the problems or the misbehavior of other policemen, because you identify with each other through the organization. Or you have this issue of not looking as closely and letting people go when they're police as well. For somebody else, you would never do that.
Yeah, I think there are also these basically the selection bias you exposed to as a policeman. So if you're a policeman, you're always dealing with criminals, so that can easily lead to a worldview where you see basically everybody as a potential criminal, and then overreact in a way to people who are not criminals.
Yeah.
Because you suspect everybody is a criminal, or at least everybody is a suspect, because you're exposed so much to certain elements of society, much more than the average person. So you, like the few percent you were talking about earlier that are bad actors. I mean, as a policeman, you're basically, that's your customer base, right? As a doctor, you're always dealing with sick people, and as a policeman, you're usually just dealing with criminals. So,
and that is probably the same reason why psychologists are always thinking that everybody is pathologically insane. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's probably the same reason. Yeah, there's selection bias going on.
Yeah, and as computer programmers, we can't really deal with people, so we don't.
Well, I think that a lot of us start to think that people should be replaced by very short bash scripts. Yes. So that's a very good point you make there. So you have this organizational problem, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the people there are bad or good or anything else. It's just an issue of how these organizations in specific work. And that is also one of the reasons these organizations have usually an enormous amount of bureaucracy and rules going on, because they have to control these negative internal processes, let's call it.
Mm-hmm.
That is why there's this insane amount of documentation you have to do, for example, when you fire your weapon. I mean, a policeman usually doesn't want to fire his weapon in Germany, for example.
At least in Germany, that's the case.
And the documentation processes are very different. The rules are very different than, for example, towards the US. In the US, you have counties and states where you have an empty magazine policy. Basically, if you shoot one shot, you should empty your magazine, because otherwise you didn't really mean it, and then you shouldn't have shot in the first place. And in Germany, it's basically you fire one shot, and the next 2 months you're just dealing with having fired that shot.
Actually, I once talked to a policeman who was training policemen, police trainer, and he said that he was basically, teaching them self-defense and how to react in certain situations, and depending on different kinds of attackers, and he actually told me that his problem was that his guys, the guys he's teaching, that they don't shoot the weapon early enough.
Yeah,
because they're more scared of the paperwork than they are of the attacker. Like he was describing that, basically a simulated situation where somebody was running towards them with a knife and they were still not using the gun. And he was like, okay, what are you waiting for? And,
so in a sense, you're describing that the bureaucracy in Germany actually has good effects. We have less people shot by police.
Yeah, probably a few more policemen stabbed though.
Well, a risk of the job, I guess.
And I think he was more referring to 2 years of paperwork, not 2 months.
Oh dear. It's
and 2 years of no,
oh yeah, you don't get a promotion for 2 years.
Promotions.
Yeah. So, yeah, bureaucracy can work. So the thing to go to is that, while all of this organization, etc., is true, and they have this relatively high level of rules to control the organization and the bad effects of the organization, like 2 months of paperwork for shooting your weapon, that doesn't mean that those organizations don't also have objectively correct processes as well. So, for example, if you're a policeman and you're dealing with the situation, usually you are expected to have a certain training to deal with that situation by best practice rules. And that is psychology, that's communication, etc. So a good policeman is trained in communicating, de-escalating, etc. So, and when you go higher up in the food chain, let's say, you have the investigators, and the investigators are not, they're not flipping a coin to find out who's a suspect and who's the actual culprit. There is a whole body of knowledge that they apply. Of course, there are always exceptions to the rule. You always have bad actors and you always have things going wrong. But in general, we're talking about the general case here. In general, people do their job based on best practice, knowledge, even scientific analysis. That is why criminology, criminalistics, forensics, etc., those are things you study. It's not make it up as you go, but there's
kick a few doors and see who starts talking.
Which is not really effective, and not
sure if you don't know which doors to kick in.
It might be effective, it's not efficient. Yeah, exactly. So, and you also have this issue that if the police cannot justify how they operate, then they fail in the judicial system. They don't get convictions, or they get convicted themselves. And if that happens, then the special position of the police as improving security is lost. And that is what you have a lot in those low trust and no trust societies, is that the police doesn't work. They break the rules all the time. Hence, they are a security risk themselves.
Yeah, it's where you usually would never call the police. It's an additional security threat. It's not of any help for you as a citizen there.
Yes.
So,
Well, that is even true in a lot of Western countries. Usually, the moment you make the police aware of you, they are kind of getting into this "we need results" phase. And that might lead to you being picked up for something else as well. You might be the victim on the one hand, but you're a victim with a kilogram of cocaine, so you go to jail as well. Always think before you call the police, is it really necessary? Do you really need to cause them trouble and waste tax money?
Yeah, don't call them for your neighbor playing the music too loud. That's for sure.
Exactly. So, and then in the police, we're taking this, or I take this perspective of let's ignore the bad apples and ignore where it goes wrong. Because there's stuff like that is always going on. And as long as it's not systematic failure, we can ignore it. So let's assume that we can ignore everything but systematic failures. So the conversation can actually be productive. The next thing then is to really think on what kinds of security organizations you have. So most of us always think about the police. That's like the main thing we think about when we talk about security. But there are a couple of other organizations in the security environment. On the state side, let's do that first. On the state side, you have, of course, the police, which has two functions, actually. So there's a peace and order preserving function, and there is an investigation and bringing to punishment function.
It's usually the difference between police in uniform and police in civilian clothing, right?
Exactly. That is what I think most people or most countries actually have that. Yeah.
The uniform, they're supposed to prevent the crime, and the ones without the uniform are supposed to solve the crime after it has happened. Like, roughly speaking.
Yeah. So, though, crime prevention, that's another topic we should go into, and we hope we don't forget that. So, but that is police. That's their function. Peace preservation and finding criminals. And their role is domestic. So that means that they deal with their own population. They deal with the population from which they themselves are recruited. And then you have the other big security factor, and that is military. So military is the same thing in a sense that the uniformed police is, except that it's not directed inwards but outwards. So military is about keeping your neighbors in check, at least theoretically. So theoretically, your military, or the primary motive for the military, is defensive against your neighbors. And then you have an additional issue with the military, and that is that the military is also the tool to employ if peaceful politics doesn't yield any results. What Clausewitz said is that war is the extension of politics with violent means. So that is the second aspect of the military, is the offensive. So you can make other countries do your bidding.
And then you often have this middle layer between the police and the geographical middle layer between police and the military, the border guards.
Exactly.
Which is often a separate organization that is just concerned with tightening the borders, controlling people going in and out of the country and stuff like that.
Exactly. So while the military is for maintaining the territorial integrity, the border guards are for controlling the territorial boundaries, and then the police is for maintaining security within the borders.
Yeah.
And that's roughly the three big organizations that people are aware of. And
what about intelligence services?
That's the additional thing. So intelligence services are harder to classify. So they're in general, there are two groups when people talk about intelligence services. There's the intelligence service proper, and then there is organizations for covert action. Those are two different things. In a lot of cases, they overlap in one organization, but those are different functions again. So intelligence services proper are for generating information. In a way, you could think about an intelligence service as something like a newspaper, and the subscribers of those newspapers are politicians and high-level bureaucrats. So the intelligence agent actually is something like a journalist that goes into the field. Then you have the editors, that is basically the analysts that take that information and put it into a story. And that thing then goes to the subscribers, which is the chancellor or the president or the generals or whatever.
And because the whole business model isn't ad-driven, the information is actually a lot better.
Sadly, it is ad-driven. So you have similar issues with awareness and selection that you have with ads, though in a much lower or different scope. But so intelligence services are really about gathering information that is actionable. And I think that's the main difference between intelligence services and the news media is not about reporting stuff that is only actionable, but they're reporting stuff that is engaging. And intelligence agencies are kind of confined to creating information that is actionable, that you can make decisions on. Mm-hmm. Information. So as a decision maker in an organization, if you are swamped with information that doesn't contribute to you choosing what decision to make, then that's a waste of time and brain power, and you don't want that. You only want information that helps you understand the world and choose what to do next. So that's actionable knowledge, and that is intelligence, basically the definition. And of course, intelligence agencies have more methods at their disposal than a newspaper. And the kind of information they gather and combine is not necessarily for public consumption. Their readers are not public. And there's a whole complexity there, which means that if a third party knows what your intelligence services produces, then that itself is actionable intelligence. It can be used to manipulate your decisions. So that is why the product of intelligence services is usually secret or restricted, at least.
But the goal is often very similar in the sense that it's about protecting the state within its own territory and outside of its own territory. And I think often these services are also divided between foreign intelligence and domestic intelligence, right?
If the goal is actually to protect the state, that is questionable. So a lot of intelligence services do not have, they don't have a mission that has anything to do with the state itself. But their mission is to create reports as they're required to do them. That's what's called the intelligence cycle. They get requests, they produce results. And in a way, the idea there is that they're just objective. That they're not mission driven, but that they're
objective.
They are meant to be objective. That they're not mission driven, but that they're report driven. That is the theory. Practically, you have to differentiate between two classes of intelligence. The number one is that it's actually coming out of the intelligence cycle. So you have a consumer of intelligence that says what kind of information they need to make decisions. And then they basically write a request for the intelligence service that says, we need this information. And then the intelligence service tries to produce it. And on the other side, you have intelligence services that have not a report-driven but a mission-driven concept, and those are those that protect something. They're about so, for example, you have that in Germany. We have the Bundesverfassungsschutz, which is a domestic intelligence agency, and that is really about finding people that are a threat to the state. That is their job. People, trans organizations that undermine to be exact, the constitutional setup of the state. Not the state itself, but the constitutional setup. And for other countries, you have sometimes similar things, but in general, outside of Germany, that task is not done by intelligence agencies, not done by domestic intelligence, but by intelligence units of the police. So you have, in other countries outside of Germany, you often have police that is also, that also has a mandate and the right to use intelligence methods. So in Germany, that's kind of not allowed. But when you look at the US, for example, you have the FBI, and the FBI is, on the one hand, a police organization. That's where the name comes, Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was created actually to deal with organized crime and shit like that during the Prohibition. And they also have an intelligence aspect.
But it seems to me the main difference there is that the police work, the classical one, is more of a reactive one, and the intelligence work is more of a proactive one.
I think that's not the right distinction. I think the right distinction is that intelligence services are about information, and other services are about action.
No, but I mean, when you have this concrete goal of, let's say, protecting the state or protecting the constitution, then you also have the Staatsschutz in the police, which is more reactive towards these certain acts that they get involved when crime happens that might have a reason that is motivated against the state, so to say.
From a theoretical and objective part, at least when it comes to Germany, the job to prevent crime and infiltration, whatever, all that stuff, is with the police. It's not with the intelligence agencies. So neither the domestic ones nor the international ones. Their job is dealing with information that informs political decisions. And the job of the police is to prevent, investigate, and capture criminals. So prevent crime, investigate crime, and catch criminals, plus preserving order in general. So, and that is actually true in most countries on this planet, is that the police is also preventative. It's usually the police that sends, for example, officers to the schools to inform about drugs. That's not the CIA coming into a school and saying what drugs not to take. That's not the CIA, but it's the police. However, the real distinction is the methods used. So you have open methods that are, you find forensics, or you have people that are reporting a crime, stuff like that. That those are open sources that you can use as a police, etc. And what intelligence agencies often do is that they access sources in a way that is not legal. The method wouldn't be legal domestically. That's one of the things. Or they are using things that would be considered subversive if the police is using it. So one of that is the use of general informants, for example. As a police service, you don't want to have people in every organization reporting on everything that's going on, because then the trust in society breaks down if everybody has to be afraid that they're arrested for anything that's happening, because there are snitches everywhere. And for that not to happen, means that we usually distinguish these intelligence gathering methods from investigative methods, because intelligence gathering methods are potentially really subversive. And that is why, for example, in Germany, intelligence agencies have no police rights. They cannot prepare evidence for court. They cannot arrest you, all these things. They don't have any of those powers. The only thing they can do is they can use a whole lot of ways to gather information. Now, that's less clearly separated in other countries. So in the US, for example, you have the issue that you have organizations that are law enforcement and intelligence at the same time. So, for example, the FBI has this double role. It's on the one hand, it's a police force, a law enforcement agency, but on the other hand, it is also allowed to use intelligence methods. It's not an intelligence agency in that it produces intelligence product for politicians, but it is allowed to use intelligence methods. So they're allowed to do untargeted wiretaps, visa, court, etc. So they can basically use subversive methods for their job. And that is where a lot of abuse comes from. A lot of what's currently going on is that there are questions if the FBI has used their intelligence capabilities during the last election campaign. That's because of these mixture of their intelligence methods and their law enforcement job, so to speak. Or when you look at the Drug Enforcement Agency, it's a similar thing. They are a law enforcement agency, so it's about catching criminals, but they are also allowed to use intelligence means. But when you look at the CIA, in contrast, which we all think is an intelligence agency, that is much more a classical intelligence agency because it doesn't have any police powers. It cannot call the court and all these things it cannot do. And it doesn't have the mandate to catch criminals. That's not the mandate of the CIA. The mandate of the CIA, at least officially, is to gather information so that politicians and generals can make decisions.
But they also did a lot of action outside of the US, right?
And that is the problem with the other thing that we often put into the bag of intelligence agencies. And that is the whole aspect of special actions, covert action, etc. And that is one of these murky territories where it's really, how do you say that? As long as intelligence agencies are just about making people drunk and interviewing them, most people don't have a big issue with intelligence agencies. But as soon as intelligence agencies run around covertly or surreptitiously break into offices, plant bugs and kill people, then it becomes a little bit problematic. And there's this issue that we have these organizations that have a similar mission as the military. They're a political tool to be applied, but on a level lower than the military. So if you send the military to your neighboring country to change politics there, that's an act of war.
Yeah, I mean they're often employed before the military.
Exactly.
And if they fail, then you bring the military.
Exactly. So the whole area of special actions, covert actions, that is what you try before you send in the bombers.
I mean, there's a long list of regime changes that have been attributed to the CIA, right? And
possibly justifiably, yes. I mean, there have been quite a few proven cases. I mean, there's this whole church committee, if you're interested. I think that was in the 70s. That's a really frightening, basically, what they did. And there's no good reason to actually believe that they stopped it. That's another thing. But yeah, exactly. So you have these covert influence, or what falls under the category of covert action is that you send in people to change things. That's sabotage, that's killing, that's supporting one party over the other, that's taking information that helps one party and give it to them, or do propaganda, black propaganda, misinformation. There's a huge toolkit of what you can do to act in the world, so to speak. But I would kind of like to ignore that part, in the same sense as I would like to ignore the offensive part of the military, because those two things, like the whole covert action stuff and the whole offensive military stuff, is actually not security. What that is political action that might come in the cloak of, yeah, we do that for long-term security, but it is politics first and foremost.
Yeah, it kind of becomes a security issue for the other side.
It becomes a huge security issue for the other side.
Okay, but let's focus on security. Do you see any more security actors on the state side, or do we have them all now?
We have organizations on the state side that are not single state. So what we have are these international security associations,
like Europol,
Interpol, etc. So they are. So Interpol, for example, is not a police. There's Pol in the word, but it's an organization that doesn't have police powers. But it's an organization that is there for information flow between police units, and it has a little bit of an intelligence and analytical job. So what they do is, when they hear from police in different countries reports about a certain criminal, they might connect the dots, say, hey, you should talk to each other. But they're an organization to help police to cooperate across country. And Interpol is probably the most famous one of them. Then for the European zone, it's not just the EU, but there are a few other countries that belong to it. We have Europol, and they have a similar mission. Both Interpol and Europol do not have police powers, and they have extremely limited investigative powers. And these investigative powers are only given to them on a case-by-case basis. So they can't fly into a country and start an investigation. That's not what they can do. Even though there are enough Hollywood movies where you have these smart, super Interpol agents that travel around the world, that really doesn't work that way. Though there's an Interpol and a Europol passport, which is an interesting thing. And then you have stuff that are more low-level police cooperation systems. So these are often for a very specific task. So you have working groups, for example, like the SIS working group, which is for communicating warrants, etc., within Europe. So that's a group of people. They all recruit from different police units in different countries, and they meet every few weeks and organize stuff and set goals for the next phase, etc. And then you have organizations that are not organized by the states, but more organized by the people working for those police or intelligence organizations. So basically they're clubs of policemen or clubs of intelligence people, etc. And they don't have a democratic mandate or a state mandate, but they're still highly influential. So, for example, you have organizations like Le Cercle, which is a group of high-ranking intelligence chiefs in Europe mostly, with, I think, the Americans being allowed to sit in from time to time. And it's an informal organization. It doesn't have any mandate. It doesn't have any any special powers, nothing like that. But it's where those guys meet to talk about how to do their job and what goals they have. And you also have that on a much higher level. And probably the highest level there is the Munich Security Forum. So that's basically a conference with additional closed social media functions where high-level people from the security services, like military, police, intelligence, from many countries come together to talk about security. And where you have open talks and where you have less open talks. And it's basically a social gathering where a lot of politics is made and a lot of common knowledge gathering is done.
Is that one open to the public? Or?
The Unix Security Conference is open to the media. So you can, if you're a journalist, you can ask and you can get accredited and you can go there. Yeah, no problem.
But not for all talks, probably.
I'm pretty sure for all talks.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean that you can also go to the workshops and the seminars. So, okay. But that is just one of the many examples. There are a lot of these specific groups that network police or intelligence or military between different states.
I think that's, at least that's my feeling, a bit where you want to go with this is that a lot of these organizations, that it's kind of dangerous to look at them from the small perspective too much, because then you kind of lose the reality of how they actually operate, and that they often operate very similar to other big organizations. Let's say, academia or industry, they have like these hierarchical structures and they have these, cross-organization conferences and gatherings and all of that. And
it's exactly the same thing. Yeah. With maybe the small difference that when these groups make decisions, those decisions usually have national impact. So if, for example, Le Cercle makes a decision to say we have to push for more cooperation between our organizations, then all the members go back to their states and lobby towards the politicians to say we need more cooperation between the organizations. So these groups do have power through the people that are there. They don't have power by themselves, but the people that go there bring their power. And the things they learn there, the worldviews they develop, etc., they have an effect on the rest of the system.
Well, but I mean, other organizations have that as well, right? If you take all the leading scientists, they have a big impact as well. And,
yes.
Or the big industry gatherings, similar.
Though much more different domain and much more indirect.
Sure.
Of course, you have lobbying and all these things. You have the science consultants to politicians, but the connection between political decision makers and security services is extremely small. They're they're not sleeping in the next bed, but in the same hotel. And there's a lot of informal talk that is going on there. And it's usually the politicians that are responsible for domestic security issues, like Ministry of the Interior, etc. They are usually the most important or second most important political domain in a party and in parliament. A lot of politics really centers around that. You probably in like older states, or not older states, but more conservative states, it's basically Defense Ministry, Interior Ministry, and Finance Ministry. If you have those three positions, you're the king. And in other countries, there's maybe the defense minister is less important and the social welfare minister is a little bit more important.
Mm. Yeah, I was just thinking why is the view of these agencies often so skewed in the public, and I think like if you compare it to industry or business and science, they are also depicted very distorted in a very distorted fashion in the media, right? I mean, let's say for business, it's always like the guy in the garage who, comes up with this great invention and becomes super rich. And in science, it's a similar thing, the crazy guy in his basement making some discovery. And then, for intelligence, it's like usually some sort of spy story or undercover agent. And it's all bullshit. Like all of this is bullshit. But it seems to me that for science and for business, more people know that it's bullshit because they've been exposed to it. They studied or they work in some sort of business and they know that it's more fictional and they have some sort of idea what the real story looks like. And I think especially for the intelligence services, less so for police, people don't really have that much of an idea what's going on and then kind of take this, spy story at face value. Yeah.
It's much more removed, and then you have additional issues there. So one of the additional issues is that a lot of the work is not public.
Well, that's kind of part of the game, right?
Well, it's even true for the police. It's not just for intelligence agencies, but even for the police. It's what happens there is not for public consumption. It's the internal processes are for the organization only, and then they produce a product that they give to the prosecutor and the judge. But the internal processes they're not for public consumption. And the only way people think how it works is from media.
But I think it's still more understandable, or like more how can I put it? It's easier to see what they're doing or honestly grasp what they're doing. Okay, there was a murder, and you have to investigate it. And of course, the way they depict it in the media is probably very distorted, but still, the general process is kind of true. But the whole intelligence gathering and analysts sitting there writing report part is usually never depicted, and people, except for let's say the Rubicon series,
which is something everybody should watch because that has a lot to do with reality.
Yeah,
but I think you're right. So especially when it comes to the intelligence functions of both police and intelligence services and so on, that is something extremely abstract. That's why I like to use this concept of saying it's a media organization, because it's very close to what people understand and it's very close to reality. But yeah, they're very specific, interesting media organizations with a very small readership and with a few less ethical tools probably. But yeah, it's very abstract. And if you're not in the business, you almost have no way of getting a picture of how these organizations work. But I think that with police, that is true as well, but for a different reason. And that is because police work is depicted all the time in media. And it's depicted wrong all the time. So for example, you have these, I think it's called CSI, that has been ongoing for, 30 years or something, however long this show runs. That is all about the forensic analysis of crime scenes. It's called Crime Scene Investigators. And that is a completely skewing depiction as well, but it's highly influential. A lot of people think that today to investigate a crime, you send in the people in the white suits and they find a lot of small shit and then they build a picture out of that and then you have the criminal, which is far from the truth.
In reality, it's just one part of the whole process.
It's one part of the process. It's an important part, but it's not even the dominant part. You can't go to a crime scene, pick up a few things and then have suspects. You have to develop suspects and then you can use forensics to match them. And the only thing you often establish with that is, presence at the crime scene or something like that. It's very few questions that you can actually answer from forensics itself, and everything else like motive or what subjects, which suspects actually existed. That's a completely different process and it requires different techniques. It's these going around asking about who were the friends of the victim or who has a key to the apartment. It's a lot of questions and collecting base information. And then you can start by developing your suspect list, and then you can attribute motive or discuss motive, and then you can talk about capabilities and blah, blah, blah. So basically you narrow down this field all the time in the hope that the crime that you're investigating is a playbook crime, like a standard crime that follows the model of most other crimes. There are those crimes that are complete outliers, and then you're really doomed with investigative methods. And you should actually come to the outliers in the future because they're going to be much more important in the future. So, but I think you're right. In a way, this whole field is something where most people only know about it from media reports and popular media depictions. So there's no real understanding of what's going on. And that is, in a way, that's also the fault of those organizations, I think, because you don't have a press conference with the police where the police is really showing their methods because they want to protect their methods as well. They don't want to school the criminals. It's the same thing that you have in intelligence agencies. Intelligence agencies don't run around and tell everybody exactly how they work because one of the main tenets is to protect their sources and their methods. They don't say where the information comes from and they don't say how they gathered it. And with police, it's a similar thing. The investigative process is something that you don't necessarily talk about because you don't want to have too many people thinking about that.
Sure, because they both have opponents, right? Intelligence agencies usually play in quotes against other intelligence agencies from other countries, and the police plays against the criminals. So if you tell them how you exactly operate, you give your opponent an advantage.
Exactly.
And from that perspective, it makes total sense that you don't reveal the methods. And even the stuff that is known is not widely known. I mean, you can read up a lot of it, especially the older stuff.
Yes. And well, even current stuff, if you really look for it. So especially when it comes to police stuff, like how does police work? How are they organized? What are the methods? Because it's a scientific field, it means that there are a lot of books out there. So you can read up on criminalistics, which is basically the science of investigating, or about criminology, which is more the science of what do we have to expect from criminals and stuff like that. So you can go to a good library in Berlin. I actually counted like police books once. It's not much, but there's enough out there that you can get a picture of it. So like the top 5-6 books are available in like 2 copies or something like that. So it's not like they expect a lot of people to read up on that. And you can get a relatively realistic picture on how police works. And the other source for that is, of course...
Yeah, that's basically, sorry to interrupt, but that's basically the educational material for the police itself, right? A lot of it.
Yes, it's education police. Yes, Exactly.
So,
or it's more actually the education material for the people that trains the police. So the actual manuals for police, they're not in the library, though they're not secret either. Some of them you can actually buy from Amazon. Most of the coursework for German police you can buy on Amazon. So, but for some reason they're not in the libraries. I don't know why. It's probably because the libraries I looked on had more like the scientific outlook and not the, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Probably no demand.
Probably.
Policemen get the course, the book when they study it. So why put it in the library?
True. So, but the other source of information is when you can get reports. So, for example, indictments and like if there are warrants that have been published, stuff like that. It depends on the country you're in, if they're public or not. But in the US, a lot of that stuff is public, so you can actually read the indictment and you can say, and they always start, with, I'm this policeman, blah, blah, blah. And based on my education, knowledge, training, then they give a little biography that is just there to tell the judge, okay, this dude appears to be knowing what he's talking about. Yeah. And then it goes into only successes, of course. It only contains the actions that actually led to a success. And it only includes the process when the process is of legal requirement. But it's a good source to kind of capture a little bit the spectrum in which they operate.
Yeah. I read a few of those. It's quite interesting often. There's sometimes some parallel construction going on, or at least I suspected that there's going on, but it is generally quite interesting.
There's a fine line between simplification and parallel construction, I think.
Yeah.
So, and those are sources that are widely available. The other thing is, policemen, investigators, intelligence people, in private conversation, they're often more open because they're annoyed often by how they're wrongly depicted in media and press and whatever. So, but what is very common is that no matter what source you take, if it's media, if it's press, if it's the people themselves, if it's their manuals, etc., it's an idealized version that they present. The policeman will always talk about how much work it is for how little pay, of course, and how stressful it is, and often how boring it is, etc., etc. And of course, they do everything by the rules, unless they really have to change the rules a little bit or bend the rules a little bit because of the importance of the case. But there's always this very idealistic view on the security services. And I think that is one of the things that are a real issue, because that has less and less to do with reality. Because one of the things in this ideal view, of course, is when a criminal gets caught, then it's of course only the police that worked on that. Or if important information was gathered, then it's always just the intelligence agency that was involved in that. And there's always this, our organization did that. And that I think that often leads to us attributing, on the one hand, too much capability and power to those organizations. We actually often think that they're much more capable than they are. That's one thing. And on the other hand, it reinforces this idea that the state alone is responsible for our security. And that has so nothing to do with reality. In a way, us talking about the architecture of security and mentioning those organizations, and if it would stop here, then we would be completely guilty of bullshitting you completely, because it's not reality.
Well, that was a nice transition. I was just just wanted to ask, what about the private security services and the other half of, or other side of the coin, so to say?
The other half, or the other 80% maybe even. So it's, if you think that learning about intelligence agencies and the police is murky territory, learning about the actual reality of how things work is far more murky. So, because there are things that the police even doesn't want to talk about internally, or intelligence agencies don't talk about internally. They compartmentalize their methods against each other as well. And they really don't want to talk about where their special privileges become used and modified and infiltrated by actors that seriously have no legitimacy to be involved in the business at all. So let's start with the trivial examples. I think it was last year when Cypherpunk 2 was taken down. So Cypherpunk 2 was this data center in a former military bunker in Germany, and they were a bulletproof hoster. And when the police took them down, they found those 200 servers or something like that. And of course, all the time they say, okay, we found those servers and we're going to analyze them now. And we went in there and did all that and stuff like that. But cybercrime is one of those areas where the police isn't actually that capable. I can still remember I had my home raided by a SWAT team once, or by armed police once, for some cybercrime issue. And after a longer conversation, they discovered that I wasn't a criminal, etc. And it was all fine and dandy. But one of the last things they actually did is they tried to recruit me. Basically said, hey, you have so much knowledge from the field. We are always looking for people that can help us with cybercrime investigations. Don't you want to work for the police? Which, of course, I declined because they pay exactly nothing, and for a lot of other reasons, like me not being very compatible with a state agency. But when it comes to cybercrime, especially to cybercrime, you have a lot of private companies that are involved directly in the action and in the investigation. So
kind of helping the police, or giving leads.
Well, it's often giving leads, but let's start very small. Very small is the police gets digital evidence. They get a computer or something like that. And very often the computer is not analyzed by the police directly, but it's given to a lab, and that lab is not a state lab, but it's a private company that will use certain protocols and whatever to document their findings when they investigate a computer. So that is a huge portion of the forensics field, both cyber forensics, but also like biological and whatever, is that a lot of that work is not done by the police itself. They get the device or the trace or whatever, and they give it to a laboratory or a specialized contractor that actually has the scientific knowledge or the process knowledge or technical knowledge to actually deal with the evidence, because the police doesn't. You can be happy if in your cybercrime organization there is somebody who knows how to use WHOIS. That is a highly qualified cybercrime investigator already when it comes to most police forces on this planet. And they rely on third-party knowledge, private knowledge, to do their job. And sometimes that is not just when it comes to forensic services, but also when it comes to lead generation and when it comes to investigation directly. So, for example, that is something that you mostly have in white-collar crime, so fraud cases, etc. When it comes to credit card fraud, for example, it's usually not the FBI or the BKA or whatever that starts a case, but it's usually the credit card companies that detect that there's crime going on, they start the investigation, they produce leads, etc. And only when they need the special investigatory powers or force powers of the police, only then they go to the police. Or when you have commercial fraud between companies, it's usually that first you go to a private investigator. They're specialized companies. They're basically corporate investigators that you can hire, forensic accountants, all that stuff. And they do all the investigative work, basically. And then just for the arrest, they go to the police. They basically take the whole case, they go to the police, put it on the table and say, we found this dude who stole 20 million from our accounts. Here's the evidence. Here's everything you need. Can we make an appointment for arresting the dude?
Well, it's a public-private partnership.
If you think about it, that's very natural, because a lot of crimes, especially when it's outside of the field of petty crime or the crimes of passion, it's usually crimes in a complex environment require complex knowledge, and not just to commit them, but also to investigate them. And the police is simply not capable of retaining that knowledge. They don't pay enough. They're not flexible enough, etc. They have to rely on outside parties. So it's a natural aspect when it comes to those crimes, that both for forensic analysis and for lead generation, etc., they are just a piece in the middle in the whole process. But that also makes them vulnerable, of course. And it makes us vulnerable, because the decision of who should be investigated or who shouldn't be investigated, and what quality of evidence is enough or not enough, it's now not something that the security services or the state security services produce based on a system of rules that is more or less legitimate, but it's now private sources. So, and this can take very extreme forms. So, for example, it's been several years, but where I had this case where a dude came to my place in the late evening, and basically wanted to bribe me to reveal customer information to him, because he was investigating a crime, an actual crime. So it was actually a many $100 million crime that he was investigating. But he wasn't working for the police. He was working for the victim, and the victim was a big corporation. And he had thousands of dollars that he could have given me as a bribe. And that is something that the police could have never done. So the police could have never come to me and said, we want that information, because they were legally barred from ever having that. Because of, special privilege under a certain blah, blah, blah. But this dude basically committed a crime by trying to bribe me. And that's a very common thing, that you have corporations that have their own investigative personnel. And it's the whole realm of corporate investigators, corporate security, etc. They are employed often directly, sometimes indirectly, by corporations, and they go out and they collect all the information in a really illegal way, often, and then sanitize it and give it to the police. So I'm pretty sure that this guy would never say, oh yeah, I went to Jonathan and I bribed him to break the law and give me the data that I shouldn't have, and that is how we found the culprit, and now we're going to arrest him. You don't get a conviction on that basis.
No, they will do their own parallel construction.
They do their own parallel construction, and there's exactly zero control about what they do. They don't have any retention duties when it comes to documents and all that stuff, like the police, which have to archive their notebooks. He basically just makes up a shit story, and then that leads to the police using force to arrest a dude, and then it's a really murky path there.
Yeah, and often the people who work, let's say, for the police, then go into corporate security, for example, and of course then they know how they have to present the information to the police and how the police actually works. I mean, what we discussed earlier about people having an unclear idea of how these organizations work, that's not true for a lot of the people working on the private side of these organizations.
Yes,
because they often come from the public side.
Dominantly, they had a career, or at least some time in the official security services, and also because they exploit connections they made there. So it's the same dude with the investigator that I mentioned. He actually introduced himself falsely as a Dutch police person, like Dutch criminal police. And only in hindsight, it was like ex-criminal police in the Netherlands. So that applied to him as well. He was a former policeman, now working corporate investigator. And of course, they know how to get into the system, how to deal with the system, and also they can use special favors. It's relatively common that you're on the private side now and you call your old buddies to let's have coffee somewhere. And then you talk about what's going on. So yeah, I have this case, blah, blah, blah. And then there's a lot of, how it's called, informal communication going on there.
Like in every other industry as well.
The only difference, and I think it's a good point that you say there's like in every other industry as well. And I think that is a really good point, because except for the special privileges that police and military and intelligence have, they operate exactly like every other industry. All the institutional flaws that you have everywhere else apply there as well. They're not better, they're not more holy, they're nothing, they just have special privilege.
Mm.
And in a way, they're all aware that they shouldn't have this special privilege. So that is why they're protected with shows of how great they are and how well they do their job and how hard their job is. Of course, they have to protect that special privilege.
Mm.
But in the end, they're just human organizations. And you have the whole shebang of backstabbing, background deals, politicking, etc. You always have that there as well. But it comes with special privilege because those people basically decide to a large part over what criminals are going to be considered criminals and who's not. Because if they don't start an investigation, nothing happens. And if they don't focus their investigation in the right direction, then nothing happens. Or the reverse. There's this Richelieu quote, give me 3 lines written by the most honest man, and I find 7 reasons to hang him. It's the same thing. If you're under the looking glass of the police, they will find something. It's one of the reasons you never talk to the police, is if they really want to find something, they will find something.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem of selective enforcement, right? That you, basically everybody is breaking laws all the time, and it's just a matter of if you enforce them or not. And they have the power to decide if they want to enforce the laws over you or not.
And the important thing there is both enforce the law and enforce it against you. In a way, they are the first level filter. So they're the ones that are the ones that decide if a crime is really a crime based on the crime scene. That they will say, it doesn't look like a crime, nothing happened here. Or they say, oh yeah, this might be a murder. These 30 stabs in the back, either it's a really complex suicide or it's a murder. But that already is a political question that can be skewed the one way or the other. Like the joking 2 shots to the head suicide. So that decision is enormous. And
yeah, and I mean, that's how when you have corrupt police, that's how a lot of stuff is actually covered up, right?
Right.
Because they will never investigate it. It wasn't a murder case. It was just...
Yeah, but I think it's not just for the very corrupt places, but it's also a lot of real life cases have a lot of ambiguity going on. In the beginning, it's not like a clear cut thing. It's a thing of probabilities. I mean, all investigative work is probabilities. There's never, or well, not never, but there's usually no sign that says A was the killer. That doesn't exist like that. What you really have is you have this huge field of leads, of evidence, of suspects, and of legal stature, and all of them come with probabilities. So what police really does is it filters through probabilities. But if you filter through probabilities, where you put your attention and how you guess those probabilities has a huge influence. So
Sure.
Can you cover up a crime as a non-corrupt police force dude? Like a single corrupt person, can he cover up a crime? Yes, if at the right position, he can skew the probability of some evidence. Then he can cover up the crime, or even the fact that a crime happened, just misdirect the investigation. So that is a thing that has implications in all directions, not just for abuse, but it's also for people accidentally being caught or people not being caught, because it is not a binary process that you're going through. It's really, you measure certain things to each other, you compare them, and you basically have to guess probabilities in a lot of cases. And then the question is, how much focus do you put on which lead? And if you are resource constrained, etc., then you might not be able to follow each lead, or you don't put enough work into it. And there are the other 20 cases. So that is one of these issues. But as soon as outside private security comes in, those probabilities are essentially exploited. So the ambiguity of investigative work can be exploited by having somebody who brings you a full case, and then you only have to verify it, which often means that one of the duties that you have as an investigator, which is not to find evidence that supports the conviction of a criminal, but also find evidence that undermines the conviction of a criminal. You have to do both, because it's a Bayesian process. You have comparative probabilities, which means you have a Bayesian analysis that you're actually doing there. And this requires that you find both positive evidence as well as negative evidence. Otherwise, you cannot make a judgment. But if an outside investigator, a private investigator comes in and presents you the case, then the negative evidence often gets lost.
Yeah, but because that would require a lot of motivation to go back and look for that evidence, right?
Or because there are other goals than finding the criminal. And that is something that plays into this whole public-private partnership a lot. There is also the political aspect of what crimes are really important. So, for example, in Germany, there are enormous resources spent on battling intellectual property crimes, from streaming sites to BitTorrent to fake handbags, etc., etc. Enormous effort is put into there. And it's not just enormous effort, but the law is written for these crimes. If you look at the surveillance laws for internet, for example, there are often glaring exceptions that say, okay, yeah, this data is only accessible in capital crimes or intellectual property crimes, where you have this double standard that is implemented all the time.
Why do you think that is the case?
Because there's a huge political pressure from private industry to enforce property crimes, intellectual property crimes.
So basically, lobbying efforts were successful.
Yes, very successful lobbying efforts to a degree that is, in my opinion, unfathomable. I mean, you have stuff like this EU directive for intellectual property that establishes the Article 13 or 16 upload filter that forces you as a platform to check if whatever is uploaded breaks intellectual property. This is such a huge break of legal rights of everybody else that it should never be in that law. But there's this enormous capital power, lobbying power that pushes politics into that direction.
But do you think that also leads to so many police resources spent on that? Or?
Yes. So on the one hand, you have the crime being defined in law with all the investigative rights, etc. And then, of course, you have the police that, by the letter of the law, should enforce the law. But when it comes to intellectual property crimes, it is actually not the police usually that does that. It doesn't start investigations.
So that's where this partnership comes in again, right? Where the industry basically identifies the perpetrators.
Yes.
And then delivers them to the police.
Yes. And when you look at that, for example, for file sharing, it's an insane system that is going on there. So on the one hand, you have these insane laws that are written. And then you have police that doesn't investigate themselves, but instead you have machines investigating that. There are those companies like IP Echelon, for example, that is basically a bunch of machines that log into BitTorrent trackers and become part of the seeder crowd of each torrent. And then when somebody else joins the torrent, they start to download from that somebody else. And if that download succeeds, the machine automatically creates an abuse message, opens a case file, etc., etc. There's no human involved there. It's a completely automated process that then leads to letters being sent to lawyers, and so on and so on. So you have those machines that basically create the whole process.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, with downloading, you have that to the point that a company like IP Echelon sends a message, XML formatted, because there's a standard on how to investigate those things, sends an XML formatted data file to a lawyer in Germany, for example. That lawyer, or to be exact, a machine at the lawyer's office, takes this file and turns this into a letter for the right internet service provider to request the identity of that person, and a letter to the court for civil filings. Unless that IP address has enough downloads through it, and then a letter to the police is generated. And those things are automatically generated, and then they're just printed out, and you have this lawyer that just signs them. That's all he does. He doesn't read them, nothing. He signs hundreds of those letters per day. Then they're sent to wherever. And the back channel is the same thing. It's completely automated.
It's like a digital sting operation in a way, right?
It is a completely automated sting operation. And
the lawyer is basically interfacing between the digital world and the...
No, he's not even interfacing that. He's only satisfying the legal demands of the process. But he's actually not in the information flow. He doesn't have to read it.
No, I mean like interfacing in the sense that he's signing the letters, and his office, probably his clerks are, putting them into envelopes and sending them off.
It's actually machines that do it because there's so much letters that have to do it, have to be sent. But yeah, so this is just one example of it's an extreme example, but it's one example of how the industry interests or private interests push the whole system and make it work for them. And it's an extreme case. I'm not a believer in intellectual property in the first place, but I consider the way in how intellectual property rights are enforced and an abuse of state powers. It's private industry abusing the state, clearly. And there's very little the state actually has from it. It's a political machine. It's a huge political machine that is involved in it. I mean, of course, you have all the media companies. Their main issue is that they need intellectual property. You have TV producers, all that stuff. There's this whole industry that, of course, has enormous political power.
Especially so since it is the media industry.
Yes.
Which has big influence over politics.
Especially in democracies.
Yeah.
Yes. So, but that is like one of those examples where even the police is just a little cog in the machine. They're not generating the leads. They don't do the investigations, nothing. They're presented the full cases. And even in bigger investigations, most of what they do is they get the case printed out plus a USB stick with only the text but without the logos. And then they print it out again with their own logos. That's how investigation works. And that's like an extreme example. But you have that in a lot of other fields as well. You have that when it comes to anti-money laundering, when you have that in fraud investigations, etc. You often have this thing where both the analysis of the evidence and the production of leads and investigation happens by private agencies. So, for example, when you look at money laundering, the way banks and financial crime investigators do their risk assessments is something that is not based on public information. It's not like there's a university that says, oh, this is the things you look out for. And it's not based on investigative results, but instead it is built on the information that is generated by NGOs often, like Transparency International, whatever, which have a relatively murky story where they come from, who funds them, etc. But they're non-governmental private entities that essentially dominate the way how investigators, risk assessment people, etc., do their job, to the point that they have enough power to disconnect whole companies, individuals, and even countries from the financial service based on really questionable reports. But it's a completely non-state mechanism that produces this data and the investigative rules, etc. is something that is operating completely without legitimacy. And it feeds back into the system, is processed by the system, is processed by government, is processed by banks, is processed by investigators. And then the force and the violence of the government is added to that, and there's a result. But in a way, government here, again, is something that is remote controlled by parties that are not actually legitimate. They just happen to be the parties some people agreed on being important in the process.
Legitimate in the democratic sense. Or?
In any sense. They're not chosen by the banks, because the banks would prefer to do more business, not less business. So they want to have only as accurate data as possible. But it is politics and industry standards that tell them that they have to use data from these organizations. So they're not used by the banks. So they're not legitimized by the banks. When it comes to politics or the state, they're not legitimized by the state either, because neither the investigators say that this information is great, nor is it written somewhere in the law. But it's a directive that says this is best practice. And the directive comes from some unelected shit Joe that is like second level bureaucrat.
So basically that's the same stuff that will happen when these chain analysis companies will become successful and in, producing risk scores for cryptocurrency addresses or public keys, right?
It's exactly the same process.
If one of them becomes the industry standard, then basically the banks kind of have to just query the risk score for a certain address, and if that is tainted too much, then they have to block the transaction, or the exchanges in that case have to do it.
Exactly. And those companies or organizations, and not just companies, that produce these kinds of data sets, the way they are put into that position where they can exercise this power is by helping the police for free. Because the more cases you show up in as a material source of information for the investigation, the higher your importance is and your justification, whatever. And then sooner or later, the court will ask, in another case, why didn't you use those, whatever, the name of the information sources? So you have those companies that companies and organizations that completely trick the system by supporting the police for free, and then sooner or later it becomes a huge business.
This what was the name recently? This finding people software, Clearview AI.
Clearview, yeah.
Similar system, right? They train their data set and then give the police a tool to identify suspects, but they can totally filter people out or skew it in certain directions.
It's exactly the same thing. So, in a way, these actors that nobody knows about, most people don't know about what actors are actually influencing the investigation process. Those actors have enormous power. It's the same thing with forensic analysis of hard disks. Yeah, as an analyst, you can find something or you cannot find something. Or the file fragment that you find, you can associate with a certain thing or you can't. And that has enormous influence. And there's no way to double check that. And in a way, it's a remote control of how the security system works, at least in one direction. It works in the other direction as well. That's something we should come to. But in a way, private actors or non-legitimate actors are able to manipulate the police, because the police and other forces rely on private input because they cannot do their job, and they will never. It's not a question of give the police more money. It has nothing to do with that. It simply has to do with the complexity of the situation. And nobody likes to talk about this outside unchecked influence that nobody can really question or test.
What do you think? How did we get into that situation? I mean, I think we have a good view now on the current state of security.
I think I would like to throw in more.
Even more?
Even more.
Okay,
so
go for it.
And we'll probably just make this a 2 episode thing.
Stick to current today.
Let's do current security today. So, because we haven't even touched on half of what matters. We have touched on what outside input is influencing the police. But you have the same thing when it comes to, let's say, policy definition. We touched on that already, but also in the intelligence field. So why is the intelligence field important? You have intelligence gathering both for political decision makers as well as for police activity. There are certain police activities where you don't wait for somebody from the public coming and saying you should investigate that, but you're proactive in searching for the crime. So a good example for that is tax crimes. You have special investigators with the tax offices that proactively go out and try to find if there's a criminal. They know that the crime itself exists to some degree, and they actively try to find people that are criminals. And you have that in other fields as well. And you also have that a lot when you think about the preventative tasking of the police. Because part of the preventative tasking of the police is to find criminal organizations that would otherwise lead to a lot of crime. So the organized crime sections are a lot about not just reacting to crime, but dismantling organizations in the first place. And it's the same thing that the Staatsschutz does. They're not just reacting to anti-state crime, but they're trying to discover anti-state crime in the first place, try to map the organizations, etc.
Place informants and things like that, right?
You have that a lot, and probably most visibly in the field of civil disobedience. So there are a lot of crimes committed in the name of civil disobedience. For example, against an energy company that wants to take down a whole village so they can get more coal out of the ground, or somebody wants to build an airport and take down a forest. And then you have parts of the population that simply don't agree with that. They sue the state and they sue the companies, etc. But in the end, they always lose. And then they resort to civil disobedience. They block the streets. They chain themselves to railroads. They climb on trees so the trees cannot be taken down and stuff like that. And police and companies involved cooperate strongly and infiltrate the organizations that organize civil disobedience. And that is one of the aspects where this cooperation between state actors and non-state actors is much deeper than we often think about that, and much more complex, because there, the intelligence side of the investigations is often done by private companies. So when you look at the private side of securities today, you have essentially three categories. You have private intelligence services, private intelligence services. You have private security services, and you have private military contractors. Those are like the three groups in the security field. So private military contractors is the easy stuff, it's Academic C, Wagner Group, etc. It's people under arms that you can send places to kill people, protect people.
Blackwater.
Exactly. And let's skip them for now. And then you have private security services. So private security services it starts with the easy stuff, like the cop in the mall, the mall cop, who's not a cop, but a private security guard. Sometimes it's bouncers, it's the guards for transporting values, etc. And depending on the country you're in, it's also like airport security, for example. So airport security, when it comes to checking passengers and luggage, in Germany, for example, is private.
Mostly, I think they often have
They have oversight by the police.
Yeah.
But the job is done by private companies. So you have big players in that field, like Securitas, for example. And they do guards mostly. And that is the low-hanging security side, but it goes further up. In the private security sector, you also have like investigators, like the dude that tried to bribe me is part of a private security outfit. He's a private eye, except that he's not hunting husbands, he's hunting criminals. And this goes up to corporate security, where you have guarding the corporation against attacks, against kidnapping of guys, etc., etc. So, but the private security field is dominated by reactive action. That is what they do. And then you have private intelligence. And private intelligence is really about information gathering. And it's probably one of the most secretive industries out there.
Would you put corporate espionage in there as well?
Corporate espionage is often private. So there are always two sides of corporate espionage. So you have the spy and you have the defenders, right? When it comes to anti-intelligence activities, that is usually done by corporate security, and I would put that under private security services. But the spying activity, that is almost never done by corporate security, because you want to have plausible deniability. And that is private intelligence services. That space is very wide as well. It starts with one-man companies that do like surveillance jobs and stuff like that. And it goes up to really big companies, like risk assessment companies that work with enormous amounts of data to create risk profiles for insurances and high net worth individuals and stuff like that. So it's a wide field. And there's this field is really interesting because it's very rare that you hear about it like in media or something, because they're usually very quiet. And if they're caught, they usually have a lot of both plausible deniability plus connections to security forces that they can make things go away. But I'll give 3 examples. So one example is a German security company, probably something like 20 years ago, was tasked with getting rid of a high-level executive of a bank in another country. And this security company is actually managed by former chief of police and former Ministry of the Interior of some place in Germany, not federal place, but on a state level. And what they did to get rid of this executive is they placed child porn on his computer. They hacked his computer, uploaded child porn, and informed the local police. And
in another jurisdiction.
And lucky for this guy, he had a sense that somebody wanted to get rid of him without, paying his golden parachute. So what he did, he hired a different security company to surveil him. And they actually found evidence of this attack. So that's the only reason he got out. And he actually sued his employer and whatever. I'm not sure how it went, how it finished. So that is one of those cases. And the only reason this case got public is because it was used in a merger and acquisition fight as smear campaign. So it actually came out like 2 years after the fact. Or you have those things where, and this is Germany as well, where in Frankfurt there was a taxi found that had surveillance tech in the taxi. So you had hidden cameras and hidden microphones in the taxi. And this taxi was specifically used by one of those private intelligence services to pick up specific people from the airport and hope that they talk on the way to the hotel. Plus it was used, and they specifically called it to companies for after meetings, because you have a meeting with a company, whatever, sales meeting or whatever, and then you leave the company and then you talk with your colleague about it. And where do you talk? You talk in the taxi back to the hotel.
Because you usually assume it's some random taxi driver who doesn't understand shit about what you talk.
That is what you think. But the taxi was equipped with all the information. And you had companies that would call specifically that taxi to get information. It's one of the reasons after business meetings, there's this impulse that people want to talk about it. And I always say, no, let's not talk about it. I first want to go to a secure place or relatively secure place before I want to debrief about a business meeting. I don't want to talk in the car. I don't want to talk in the train. I don't want to talk in the plane. I don't want to talk in the hotel.
What's even worse is when you start talking about the negotiation when the other person leaves the room.
Yes.
When you're on their turf, basically,
Well, that is just stupid. I mean, it's common practice that when you have a business meeting and you go to the toilet, you keep your phone on the desk with the recorder running, or you put something into your luggage, whatever, or under the table to record. And it's common practice. You really have to wonder why this cheap spy tech on Amazon is available. Really think about that. You have electronics there that to develop cost several €100,000. It's not cheap to develop a micro recorder that is the size of the tip of your pinky. It's not cheap. And to set up a manufacturing chain, etc., you have to sell a lot of these devices to make a profit there. Or micro cameras that are the size of your thumb, where the lens is the size of a needle. That is stuff to develop that's hundreds of thousands of euros you have to put in there. And to set up the manufacturing process is expensive. And then you can buy that for under 100 euros. That should give you pause, because it means that people are buying hundreds and thousands of those devices. Often because they're so cheap that you don't even have to recover them. So there's a huge market for espionage going on. And it's private espionage. We're not talking about what the CIA or NSA or CSS or whatever is using, but we're talking about private spies. From, I want to look what my maid does or what my husband does, to I want to spy on my business partners.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's not just like corporate spying, it's also like personal relationship spying.
Of course.
It's huge. Like bugging phones and other things.
It's huge, but just when you think that you can do an espionage operation against your significant other and you use those technologies, do you really think that somebody who does something like that would not use the same technologies in business? Of course he would. So alone from that, you have to develop a perspective that it's not something exotic that happens once in a decade. It's something that happens every single day, everywhere. It's a common practice.
Which is why you should never put these nice presents from your business partners on your desks.
That's a really good point, because the transmitting desk lamp is cheap, and the logo, the 3D logo thing is transmitting, and the expensive diplomat pen is transmitting. Yes, it's all transmitting, potentially.
Maybe that's why I always get these pens, like these for my company. Like these sample pens.
I think that's a different thing, but if I wanted to place something like that in a small company, I would send a rigged sample pen as well.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah. But so that, let's come back to the topic before we incriminate us, because all of that stuff is of course illegal, and we would never do that in any place. It would be a crime. It's purely hypothetical. Just by the size of what technology is available, you can extrapolate how big the issue is. And from that, you can extrapolate that there are specialists. So that alone gives you, or should give you a warning on what's going on. So this taxi driver is like one thing, but it's not that we find out, okay, it was this big company that we know about that did it. Because the big companies don't spy themselves. They have people that spy for them. A lot of them, of course, again, former policemen, former intelligence people. So one of the things you have, and that's another case that I think is educational, is you have degrees of separation between the company that wants the information and the intelligence operative. And a good example for that is the scandal that is currently still going on about Credit Suisse. Credit Suisse was ordering surveillance on several on their board members. So we're not talking about like some low-level person that a random person from corporate security could spy on, but we're talking about the highest level of actually employed people in their company that were spied on by the company itself. And they actually spied on their CEO. There was parts of the board that organized a surveillance campaign against their own CEO. And through a layer of, I think, 2 lawyers and 2 private investigators, they finally came to the one dude who would then surveil this guy. And there were actually 2 cases, 2 people involved in the targets of the surveillance. And the interesting thing is that the whole stuff blew up, was discovered. And instead of having a complete investigation, what happens is that one of the in-betweens hangs himself. He's dead. He's not going to talk anymore. And a lot of those cases, when they come into public light, one in-between or the operators can't live with the failure anymore and die. And it's a common thing. If you look at the published cases, I would guess it's 30 to 50% of all cases, one of those people dies. And it's a common thing.
So you think it's murder in that case?
I didn't say that.
Or in some of these cases?
I didn't say that. I'm just saying it's not a healthy business to be in. I'm not saying
you're saying, but I'm wondering what you're thinking. I mean, if you're some lawyer in between, why would you hang yourself for that?
Let's make an assumption. If you're a nation state and you have somebody attacking you or being in your way, an individual, for example, would you consider killing that individual? And the answer is yes, because it's one of the dominant methods of nation states is to wage war. Or you have your special activities division that kills them. And that's a common thing. You have public operations against Iran, where you have motorbikes driving next to cars with scientists in them, and then the motorbike drives away and the car blows up. Common method, the magnetic bomb on the car, invented, as far as I know, by the Israelis. They have killed somewhere about 40 people in Iran over the last 20 years with that. Or you have car bombs against magnates. Or you have this journalist in Malta that is blown up by a car bomb. Or you have the journalists in Slovakia being shot. So there are for sure actors that feel that killing people is okay.
Sure.
And not out of personal reasons, but for strategic or even tactical reasons. And the people that make those decisions are people that through a selection process ended up in the high ranks of power. The selection processes that you have in government are essentially the same as you have them in industry. If you're a big corporation, you're basically going through the same filtering process that you go through when you're in a political party. The mechanisms are basically the same. And it's the same social milieu. You hang out with politicians if you are a head of industry, and you hang out with heads of industry if you're a politician. And if you're a decision maker in the security field, you hang out with decision makers in the private security field. And you have coffee together at the circle. And it's the same people. Now, my question is, how should anybody assume that private industry doesn't use the same methods as questionable nation states or organized crime? It's the same people, just different sides of the law. But there's no huge difference in morals and ethics there. So what I'm saying with that is I would not ever be surprised if there is quite a lot of private murder going on. And there are actually at least one scientific study on private intelligence. And one of the quotes from the book is that if you're in a tier 2 capacity, so that's the description for mid to high level private intelligence organizations, is that there are quite a number of people that die. So it's a normal thing. And if you're interested in the book, I think it's only available in German. But I think it's required reading if you're interested in that subject. And it's called Private Intelligence by Stefan Blanke. And I think it's his PhD thesis, I think, that was turned into a book. And it's called Private Intelligence Activities by Non-State Actors. It's like a 200-page book. And there is a lot of activity going on in that field, but it's very quiet. But it's not independent of the state. So as I mentioned before, civil disobedience and big corporations in the state, there's a huge overlap of interest there and a huge amount of cooperation. So what you will have, for example, is that private intelligence services infiltrate groups, place informants there, or even agents provocateurs. And then when that group becomes active in a relevant sense, that informant is basically traded. It's sold to the next private intelligence agency that is dealing with that, or it's even sold to the state, or at least the reports are sold to the state. So, of course, the state doesn't have the resources nor the deniability to infiltrate those groups. But if those groups become active, it would be really nice to know where they're going next. And that is where private intelligence comes in. They invest in informants that they place into organizations. When you look at Extinction Rebellion, for example, today, I think there's good reason to believe that there are dozens of informants private informants in Extinction Rebellion, plus probably another dozen that is run by MS whatever,
Because they infringe on corporate interest?
Because they are infringing on corporate interest and infringing on state interest. So that's why both parties are active there. When it comes to...
And they are big enough that they become a target.
They have enough effect that...
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Though there's this thing... It's been a few years ago where it was discovered that several small left groups in Germany were infiltrated by the police. And the infiltration was actually done by an ex-police person.
Yeah, I remember that.
And this person infiltrated something like 5 organizations. One person infiltrated 5 organizations. It is extremely conservative to guess that in the field in Germany, there are more than 1,000 active informants, like informants for pay, that do nothing else but infiltrate groups for pay. With 1,000 people, each of them infiltrating 5 organizations, you can infiltrate 5,000 organizations privately.
But how can you, when you work as an informant, infiltrate 5 organizations at the same time?
They just have to be related to each other. And that is exactly what happened in this case in Germany.
So you're just one of the very active...
You're a very active activist. And of course, you're active in Greenpeace and Extinction Rebellion. And that becomes really bad when they're like capture bounties. Then this tactic becomes really bad. In Germany, I'm not aware that we have capture bounties for anything. But a good example of what capture bounties does is when you look at the US. So in the US, if you discover a cell of terrorists, you can make a lot of money, like a shitload of money. Or if you discover somebody who's evading taxes, you get a percentage of the taxes that he's stealing. And those bounties make it, they're really high. So for like a single terrorist, so to speak, you get between 50 and 250,000 US dollars. And the level of quality for your investigation has to be not very high. And there are people out there that basically create phony terrorists to be sold to the FBI.
Yeah.
Or that go into companies just to find out if those companies are playing with their taxes.
They talk people into becoming terrorists who would never have the cleverness and money to actually become terrorists.
And you have the same thing for tax evasion. You have people infiltrating corporations, maybe even suggesting what this corporation should do in their accounting, etc. And then later they, quote unquote, whistleblow. And similar processes you have more or less everywhere. And you have people that are specialized not just in faking these things, but you have companies that actually have relatively high internal oversight that do private infiltration intelligence services. They steal data. They use IMSI catchers, everything. The people working there are very often ex-police, ex-military, ex-intelligence. They know what they're doing. They still have connections to their old buddies. And it's a very profitable business. When you have the right information at the right time, you can make a shitload of money. And it's a very quiet business. And only from time to time you have things blowing up, like Black Cube in Israel, basically run by ex-Mossad and ex-8200 people that broke into iPhones all over the world and that were involved in investigating the journalists, investigating the one of those Me Too cases. So it's a huge field. And it's very quiet because nobody really, most of the time they do their job well, which means that they're not detected.
Yeah, nobody has an interest talking about it either.
Not even the police, because often those organizations help the police as well. They share information, they share leads, etc. And this goes to extreme ways. So what really happens at some point is everybody knows that police organizations and intelligence organizations cross country, they share information. You have things like 4 Eyes and 14 Eyes, which are formalized information sharing organizations between intelligence agencies. You have that on a bilateral level all the time, and you have that on an informal level all the time as well. And it's false to think that that only happens between state actors. Of course not.
Of course not.
The state actors would be stupid if they wouldn't involve private actors as well. And those private actors only participate because they gain something from it, which means you have the information flow in both directions. So, and that is something you have when you look at those security conferences, for example, that we mentioned before, or those informal working groups, and you look at the participants there. Most of them will be police or intelligence from a state. And then you always have these industry people. IBM, Nokia. Why are they there? Because they're doing this surveillance equipment. Or some insurance. Or some bank. Why? Because they're making the risk assessment product. And then you have those consultancies. And the consultant working at that meeting has been part of this consultancy for a few months before the meeting and a few months after, and then he's gone again. Well, he was lent to that consultancy to create cover, and he's working for a completely different private organization. You have that all the time. If you only look into the stuff that is available at the surface, you will realize that our system has very little to do with this ideal of clear separation of private and public, what's the state, what's not the state, or the clear separation, what is intelligence and what is police, or the clear separation between politics is calling the shots and everybody else just executes. That is complete bullshit. That's not how it works anywhere on this planet anymore. If it ever worked like that. I highly doubt it ever worked like that. But what we learn in school about the cleanness of our system has nothing to do with reality.
I mean, Nazi Germany was a public-private partnership. One could say.
Yes, that's the extreme example.
Right?
Yes. But fascism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's often depicted as the focus is often on the state side, but the important role the industry played is usually overlooked or downplayed.
And that is true today as well. And I think what is true today is that all those non-legitimized organizations with special powers, not legal special powers, but factual special powers, are completely ignored. And it's completely ignored how many people are active in the security and intelligence world. I mean, look at something like HCPP. It's a hacker conference of 500 people. Do you really think that no private intelligence agency ever sent somebody there to just see what's going on? It might be some product in 5 years, depending on if those crypto anarchists ever get something done or not. Or, there's this cryptocurrency scene. They want to get away with the banks. If I were a bank, I would hire a few people to keep an eye on the players there.
Yeah, of course.
It's naive to think that you wouldn't. And
it's all basic game theory, right?
It's basic game theory. And they're basically everywhere. I mean, I'm not talking about paranoia, but I'm talking about the system of security that we have today is a very widely spread, multi-layered system that in my opinion, is more like antique Byzantine. It's presenting a nice and easy understand and easy media consumable picture to the outside, and on the inside, it's having a complexity that escapes probably even the players in the field. And who's doing the bidding, who's following which interest, I think there's no clear cuts anymore. The amount of influence, both positive in the sense of, raising interests, as well as the negative influence, manipulating investigation, manipulating data, etc. Both of that is rampant and it's everywhere. And the results of that can be dramatic. I think, for example, that when you look at the Ross Ulbricht case, Silk Road, what you see there is agents of the FBI becoming rogue and running with money. In a single case, there were at least 2 that did that. I'm pretty sure that it happens so much more. If it happens with this little money in one of those high-profile cases where the risk of getting caught is so enormous, it must happen in a lot of other cases. And if it works in the one direction, the corruption of an officer, then it also works in the other way, the influence of a private party on the process. And in a way, you also saw that in the Silk Road case again, because that case really only blew up because a politician and not a member of the executive called for blood. And that actually shows that the system is not working. It is not what it presents itself to be.
What do you think? How we get there? How did we get there? I mean, is it just like, okay, society developed that way and that's how we ended up there? Or are there like some deep technological forces at play that kind of led themselves to the situation, or what's going on?
I think the current state has been the old state forever. So I actually don't believe in this nice picture people paint about how the state systems work. We develop democracies with our highly efficient and uncorruptible bureaucracies. I think that has always been marketing. It's never been true.
Good marketing, though.
Very good marketing. I mean, they are really good when it comes to marketing, for sure.
People go and die for it.
Wow, yeah.
Right.
Good point. But security is a fundamental human driver. Everybody wants security. Every individual wants security. Every corporation wants security. Every group, every organization, everybody wants security. Because it's only security that allows us to operate in the world. If we had no security, we couldn't operate. So the interest of knowing what's going on, being able to get away with bad actors and maybe abuse that a little bit against your competitors is a natural thing. And that probably went on forever. The only thing that changed, I think, is that a lot of people bought into the marketing that it's not so.
But I mean, the picture you basically painted now, if I look at it from an individual perspective, I don't feel very secure, to put it bluntly. I mean, it's state interests at work, corporate interests at work, but it's not really helping my security.
It is helping your security because a little bit of security provisioning is necessary for the marketing, I guess. And to be exact, it is very necessary. There must be some security for the state to have some legitimacy. So it's not that you're insecure. It just means that the processes of security have nothing to do with the story everybody tells you. And in a way that for me only means, I think we are enormously naive in the West. We're enormously naive to believe that our systems are those perfect little things that work exactly as described on paper, and that other people are going to take care of us from the goodness of their heart. This idea that we have when we talk about the state is there are people that are risking their lives and risking their marriages and get stomach ulcers and whatever, because the only thing that they're living for is our well-being.
Protect and serve.
We have this assumption that all of those people are angels and that they're not just good and perfect in their hearts, but also the smartest and most powerful beings out there, and that there's no other. And that is, come on.
Well, I mean, there are also people who believe that they're basically cops are pure evil. And
which is exactly the same bullshit. It's both of those extremes are radical oversimplifications of reality. Reality is being able to predict and influence the world around you is the basic human thing we do. That is why we have big brains. You walk down the street in a certain direction that requires prediction. You look at the street and you see, okay, there's a hole in the street, I cannot go there. That's the basics of intelligence. And you change your plans. So that is what we all do. And everybody else does it as well. And it's the corporations that do it. It's probably churches that do it as well. You know, the Vatican, you never know. They probably have their own thing going on. And you have states doing it. And it's a messy world because nobody is out there to just live for you. The idea of the modern Western liberal state is Big Mama is out there and Big Mama only cares about you. Really think about that. That's the biggest bullshit that could ever exist. Of course, there are conflicting interests out there.
But it is convenient and easy bullshit. We basically are now almost spoke 3 hours about this topic and just got a rough picture of it. I would say, I mean, better picture than what I've heard, what I usually hear, but we haven't covered everything yet. So, of course, it's easier to go like, oh yeah, all cops are bastards and be done with it, or
all cops are angels.
Yeah, or believe in the police will take care of you when you just have a problem. You just call, 911.
Yeah. Or the most intelligent people only work for the state. Yeah. Yes, it is convenient. It is really convenient to shut your eyes in front of trivial realizations about how the world works. It's trivial.
And without going too far into the future, I mean, this is already like pretty shitty situation, I would say. Very complicated, and my guess is it's going to be a lot more complicated in the future, and we fundamentally have to rethink our approach to security.
I think it has already become extremely more complicated in the last 30 years, and we will touch on that in the next episode. And it's going to be really rough in this decade and the following.
Because it's going to be the transition period, or why do you think it's going to be rough?
Because technology develops, and one of the big things that have developed is technologies that make globalization possible. And big technologies in that field are international logistics and international communication, but also organizational technologies. How do you organize organizations has changed a lot since the 80s. And that has huge implications on what territories exist, what security really means, and where we're going with security. So look at it like this way. In the 1800s, the complexity of organizations was much smaller than we have today. And a big reason for that is because you had to use your typewriter and maybe the telegraph, or later people would have a telephone. But the way of how you communicated was relatively basic compared to today. Today we have computer systems that are just about communication. We have software like Slack and IRC and Twitter and whatever. We have communication technology to an extreme. And we also have much better reporting technologies. So reporting is, what did you do? What did you achieve? Etc. In the olden days, it was, you had a guy standing next to you counting how much stuff you produced as a sample. And then he would go to the next guy and the next guy and whatever. So their reporting was always sampling. And today we have companies that are specialized in surveilling every keystroke of the person they're working for. We have private surveillance systems in your home, in the company, etc. We have AI to analyze how productive you are. And we also have new incentive structures, or to be exact, we have better functioning incentive structures. And that is financial markets. So 200 years ago, financial markets were not global, or they were relatively slow while global, which actually, there's an interesting story there that in the Napoleonic Wars, it was actually British banks that were running most of the spies because they reported back to Britain to influence the stock trades. So you had private spies surveilling the war and then racing back to navigate, to communicate what the outcome of the war would be, because it was super important for the trades of the banks. And today we have global financial markets. You can indirectly profit from activities. And that means that today organizations can be much bigger, much more distributed, much more complex, and still be run by essentially the same number of smart people, but they're empowered by technology, by communication, reporting, and incentive technology. Which means that today a lot of activities become much more complex and can have a far longer reach. Strategic planning for organizations makes sense. The small example is criminal markets. So your ability today to buy data and technology for crime on specialized markets, if that's on the darknet or somewhere else. That's something that in that form never existed before. It's an outcome of technology. It means that even dumb criminals can use smart technology today to commit their crimes. But it goes further, because those markets not only sell technology, but you can hire people. We have criminal human resource management organizations today. You can have complex networks and supply chains to deal with your crime. You have the ability to commit complex crimes. Stealing a credit card and using it is a complex crime.
Yeah, what we talked about in the last episode, drop gangs. I mean, that's basically also a modern form of organizing often crime, which is enabled by technology, right?
That is exactly that. Drop gangs couldn't have existed 30 years ago. Today, they can exist and they can thrive. And the thing that is now happening is that because of technological advancements, the intelligent criminal, the mastermind criminal, and the random criminal become more important. we mentioned that before, that when you're an investigator, you want standard playbook crimes because they work on the basis that you can create a list of suspects that you then can filter through. So investigations like that work well. Things that don't work well are random criminals. So, for example, the DC shooter was a few years back. You had this guy or two guys actually, that had a car from which they could covertly shoot a sniper rifle.
Wasn't that like this guy with his son? Or a stepson or something?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
And
like they would randomly kill people
from a covert position. Investigating such a crime requires that people witness what's going on. And it was very hard to witness that. If those attackers would have had, instead of one car, 3 cars with the same technology, just looking differently, they could have done that for years without being captured. Because it was only the recognition of the same car that basically led to their trail. If they had broken that, they would have been enormously difficult to get because they were random. The people they killed, where they killed, etc., was relatively random.
So no motive, no connection to the victims. I mean, no motive you can trace.
Yes, no revealed motive.
Yeah. Usually you have some sort of relation to the victim. It's
the moment where technology allows random criminals to have more effect, random crime becomes more relevant. Not just because of the effects, but also because random criminals continue their crimes usually until they're caught. Which means that a few random criminals can have much longer successful careers, which inspires other people to be random criminals. You have that in property crime a lot when it comes to stealing stuff. You have that a lot when it comes to cybercrime. And the moment stupid people can become random criminals with a successful track record, then investigative methods in that field break down a lot. That's one side of the story.
And the other is the increased complexity of organizational complexity of crime organizations.
Exactly, because that allows very smart people to run relatively effective organizations.
I mean, you also read the mastermind about Paul LaRue.
That is a super example.
I mean, he was basically, they single-handedly created this crime empire and was managing that. It's a definitely recommended read. It's totally crazy.
And there are probably a few hundred people like him operating right now. Maybe even a few thousand. So people like him, when it comes to capabilities, are rare, but not that rare. We have a world of 9 billion people. And making those moral judgments is a slippery long slope. He didn't start out being a mastermind criminal.
If one of them is listening, you can also send us letters. It's on our website. We would like to hear your story.
Because we're actually fascinated with high intelligence crime, actually. So because of technology, those organizations can function today. In the past, if you were the really smart criminal, you were very locally confined, which exposed you to randomness, a lot of randomness, and made it very hard to protect yourself in the field. Violence was more important than being smart. With technology that allows you reporting, communication, etc., you have a level of indirection that allows you to exploit, direct and command people in your organization much more better. And being caught in that field there's this problem that high intelligence criminals fall out of the investigative pattern as well, because they're extremely adaptive and because they anticipate and correctly anticipate investigative behavior.
So basically we have a situation where technological developments create two groups of criminals, namely the random ones,
the successful random criminal,
low grade of organization, and then the like some high intelligent masterminds creating like very organized crime cartels, or how you want to call them, and both of them basically elude traditional investigation methods
and the traditional architecture of security forces,
which means that the current security architecture will fall short in the future. And if you want to be secure against these actors, we have to find different solutions.
Exactly. But that's a whole topic on itself, and we should do that in the next episode, because otherwise this episode will be too big to upload.
Exactly. And I'm will be too tired to do another episode of that length right now. So this was basically current and future security, part 1, current security. But before we close, we always do our donation report and give you some infos. So as always, we're very happy if you send us some feedback. You can send us an email at bitstream@task0.org. You can also write us physical letters. We even take your dirty fiat in the mail. And you can find the address on task0.org/bitstream. And to report on the donations, again, as always, in the currency we got the most donations in, which was again Bitcoin. So this time we got 5.26 millibitcoin in Bitcoin and 0.2 millibitcoin in Bitcoin Cash. And that's roughly 19% of the German minimum wage we got in donations for the time we spent on making these episodes, which is rather depressing for us. I did the math. So basically, 1 person in 1,000 listeners does a donation. So if you're listening to this right now, it's very likely that you're a free rider.
Be ashamed. Be very ashamed.
Yeah. Maybe we should really start adding advertisements.
They would pay more.
It would pay more. Or sell premium episodes.
No, let's not do that.
Maybe not. Anything else you want to add?
Send us more money.
Listen to this. Smuggler needs more money. You know, he's starving. Please.
It's not that bad, but it's a good way of you showing us that what we do is actually worth it. Because if nobody shows us that what we do is worth it, it might not be worth doing.
Yeah. And it kind of undermines my trust in humanity, because now I'm understanding why everybody's doing these fucking ads and some weird premium content.
Enough whining and begging. We need more from you, not just money.
Send us letters. No drugs, please.
Questions, comments, everything. We need to hear from you.
All right. And so until next time, thank you very much.
See you.
Bye.